lips of clay, that my words may not be mine alone, that we all may be touched by your holy scripture. In Jesus' name, amen. Firstly, preparation for church is a privilege and a joy. It's something I enjoy. And I arrive early and take part in that, and you get slightly bogged down in practical preparations. And I personally rely upon the music ministry to lift me back up to where I need to be. And this morning's anthem was sublime, absolutely extraordinary. I'd like to thank all of you for that. We must ensure it gets more widely heard. It's exquisite, exquisite. So I have two pieces of scripture to preach from today because, we hear so much scripture in MCC, in this particular church, I might add, in this particular church, partly because it binds us into our, those men and women who went before us, who shared a faith, but shared very different circumstances and experiences. So when we come to read the Psalms, and I listen to Psalms almost all the time, every day, I listen to Anglican chant in the car, which is a polytonal setting of the Psalms, from the translation by Thomas Coverdale, which is just exquisite, just beautiful. So I listen to those words, and each and every one of them is an individual crying to God from their personal circumstances. And when we see ourselves represented in the sorrows or the joy or the ecstasy or the fear or pain of somebody who may have lived 2,600 years ago, it's an extraordinary community that is built up, a community that is immune to death. A communion of saints, where the words of the saints are still heard by us, and we may share in them. Not all of them. As I say, the circumstances are widely different. The words of those saints come just as our words do in prayer, not as a diktat to our neighbour, but as an expression of our exquisite relationship with God. We often worry about our ability to pray, and St. Paul has great comfort for us. I could not write what St. Paul wrote about prayer if, rather like the metaphor of the 1,000 monkeys that are put in a room with 1,000 typewriters, and in a million years eventually they'll produce the great works of Shakespeare, and just by chance, if you sat me in a room for a million years, I would not produce St. Paul's letter to the Romans. I don't have it inside myself. St. Paul speaks better than I do on this, speaks better than I hazard any of us can on this, but we can find ourselves in his words. I worry often that when I speak my prayers, it's just vanity. I'm finding something appropriate or clever to say. When I'm speaking my prayers at night, I know that my words are lagging behind my thoughts, which is lagging behind my spirit, all of which is lagging behind the sense of the divine. And yet I'm trying to find something appropriate to say in the presence of God. And St. Paul comforts me here when he says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Some translations have it as groanings too deep for words. And I'm reminded, and I preach again, the insight I gained into that from spending time with the dying and with the newly born. When you are suffering, there is a truthfulness in the sounds you make, which is sorrowful and tragic, but it is utterly truthful. A cry of pain conveys in itself more than words can ever convey, and the crying of an infant conveys within itself more meaning than is ever just in that shout, in that sound. When children are very, very young, they scream, I hunger, I hurt, they laugh, they giggle, they respond to their parents in ways far more profound than we are able to do as thinking adults. We filter everything through so many layers of experience, and the fear about what other people will think about our words, and the fear of how we will look saying and doing certain things, that we lose some of that truthfulness. And St. Paul reassures us that our soul is still in perpetual perpetual communication with the divine, in groanings too deep for human understanding. So when I am speaking as eloquently as I can, my soul is still groaning the groans of the newborn babe or of the dying soul. And I am able to communicate with my God so much more profoundly than all my words and education have equipped me to do. Just cling to those words of St. Paul, because there is comfort in them. St. Paul was speaking to a community that was greatly distressed about their place in the world and where their place in the world was going to be. It ended up being the center of Christendom. But at the time Paul was writing, the center was still in Jerusalem in the Middle East. And the Roman Christians must have felt very isolated. It was still largely, although St. Paul was fighting against that, self-identifying as a Jewish sect. Christians, first and foremost, saw themselves as Jews, and therefore those Christians in Rome very frequently saw themselves as peripheral. But St. Paul tells them that there are no powers on earth that can come between you and the divine, come between you and God. And the specific way that he says it unpicks some of the realities of our world. We believe that we are enthralled to certain powers, but they only have power because we consent to give them power. There are natural powers which are morally neutral. The earthquake and the storm and the burning heat of the sun, these may afflict us, but we recognize that it's not personal. We recognize that such things cannot become between us and our God. In fact, sometimes they drive us a little closer. But those things which we are most fearful of are the product of humanity's own musings, kingdoms, principalities, powers and presidents. All these things exist because we give them common consent, generationally, year after year. And we must understand that such things that exist through our consent can have no fundamental power to interpose themselves between us and our relationship with God. Politics, we will always argue about politics, my goodness. But God straddles all divides, whether they be political, whether they be national, language, or race, or age. God straddles these things, and I would add them to the list of those things that St. Paul says can never come between us and God: distress or persecution, famine or nakedness, peril or sword. So St. Paul speaks to me powerfully today, but let us also turn to the gospel. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that somebody took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes like a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Well, you've all got beautiful pew slips today. You have lovely service booklets. If you look at the front cover of them, what do you see? You see a mustard plant, black mustard. Brassica nigra, if I remember, grows all over Europe, the Middle East, and various parts of North America. My point being with this, if I'm going to unpick more of the gospel, it's nice to think about the one dimension that's written in the gospel of, well, faith doesn't have to be much, but it can produce great results. But think further about the mustard seed. Think about what the mustard plant actually does. We're talking about birds being able to roost in its branches. We're talking about other creatures being given comfort and succor and solidity by this thing. It's not just a plant, it's not just a single event, it's not cause and effect. There's a tiny mustard seed, just like your faith, because you're all godless heathens. This is Jesus saying this, not me. But look, it is nurtured. You know, we've had a botanical few weeks here, haven't we? We've had the parable of the sower, and then we've had various other plant-related things. And we come now to the mustard seed. And in the parable of the sower, we heard about that extra layer of meaning where it's not quite enough just to think that we are victims of the sort of soil on which we are sown, but we have a hand in nurturing and cultivating that soil. Well, of course, the more soil is planted and the more thing grows in it, the better the health of the soil. The roots break it apart and make it friable. They allow earthworms to pass through it, and they allow it to retain water. Many particular types of plants nurture and feed the soil. As I mentioned last week, the pea family, all plants from the pea family, have nitrogen-fixing nodules in the roots, which put nitrates into the soil and then allow for the growth of not just them, but plants which are then going to be planted around. I have some notes here, and I haven't looked at them yet. I probably should, shouldn't I? Matthew's argument is not just about utility. It's not just, well, if you are planted as a small mustard seed, you can grow into something which is going to be practical and wonderful. It's also salvific. It's talking about the flowering of the human person. It's talking about you finding your salvation from something which appears to be nothing, that small mustard seed, growing into something extraordinary. The mustard seed parable, however, calls us to be more than consumers. For a fruitfulness has more than one end. We are not looking to merely consume the resources around us, whether they are the resources of our fellows or the resources of our church or the resources of our Christian community, and flourish and flower for our own purposes. We are also looking to flourish and flower for the purposes of those around us. The growing of the mustard seed into the plant, as I say, nurtures the soil. It also shades the soil beneath it. It becomes a place where many creatures can live. It becomes a place where the birds of the air may nestle in its branches and shelter from the sun, and it becomes a fruitful plant in itself. So the seeds are taken and they are powdered up and made into mustard, which flavors flavorless meat. In addition to which, they are made into mustard plasters and slathered over areas which are painful. And mustard plasters, certainly for several thousand years, were the go-to thing if you had aches and pains. So the aching of the muscles of our fellows are salved by that mustard plaster, which is made from the plant which shelters the birds, which breaks up the soil, which cultivates it and shades it, and ultimately comes from that tiny mustard seed. You see what I'm getting at? We tend to read all these parables as if they're just personal things, you know. I can do this if I do that, or, you know, I have no faith, but I want some faith because I want to get to heaven, and therefore I do this, and that's what happens, you know. Christianity is not an almighty, gigantic bribery and corruption scandal, you know. It's not a protection racket. It's not a system whereby you are bribed by hope of heaven and terrified by fear of hell, because as I've said many times from this place, if you have children or if you have a loved one and you discover that the only reason they gave you a present is because somebody threatened to hit you, then it doesn't really seem all that loving an act. And our acts must be more than just fear or hope. There has to be more. And I do believe that in this particular gospel, although it goes on to talk about how fruitless things are burned, which is basically coming from an agricultural motif, so the plants that do not bear fruit, like the tares that we saw last week, we just burn them up. You know, we don't punish the damn things, we just get rid of them. They're useless. There are parts of our own life which it's our duty and our inspiration in our Christian faith to inspect and to discern whether they are producing fruit, and sometimes we have to burn the damn things as well. This is part of our growth spiritually and as members of Christian community, to discern individually and as part of that community, or what has proved fruitful and what is useless. What do we still need to devote resources and energy and nourishment to, and what can we clearly say is now seared and dry and unwanted and can be burned up. And even the burning up of the thing is not bankrupt. Burning produces heat. Burning can warm you. Burning can cook your food. You know, these metaphors that we find in our scriptures, the ancients who came before us were used to seeing level upon level upon level of meaning. We have to get back into the habit of it. But we have to get back into exegesis, pulling the meaning out of something which we're used to seeing as one dimension. And yet here, I've already hammered the thing to death. So we don't just have the mustard seed, we have this extraordinary plant providing services for the environment in which it lives and for the creatures that surround it, and then producing mustard plaster, which flavors the unflavored meat, and you can decide what that is yourselves. But it also eases and salves the pain and the suffering of our fellows. So the mustard plant was a pretty good choice. You can go on preaching for about 15 hours. Shall we see whether I can do it? Does anyone have a stopwatch?
Yes.
Now, one thing that I used to find when going to art galleries and listening to people talking about a piece of work is I come to the conclusion that the critic was finding far more in the painting than the artist ever found. And I used to poo-poo this. And I used to be of opinion that preachers frequently found far more in Scripture than anyone could have thought of writing into it. But you must also think that that particular Scripture was not just scribbled down on the back of a piece of paper whilst a bunch of folk were wandering around behind Jesus. They weren't dictation. It wasn't like the secretary back in the day walking behind someone and saying, "Take a letter, Miss Jones." These were pondered for 30 years in some cases. These words and traditions of Jesus, the Christ, the Anointed, the Messiah, that's all those words means. These were pondered by a community and by individuals for 30 years. 30 years! And in that gospel, as much meaning was to be squeezed as represented the experience of this person, not the facts about that person, but the experience of this person, so that person may be experienced by others. So it may be that I only touched the surface on this mustard plant. And it may be that it's your job from now on to look at this text and to work out where your little mustard seed is going to go, and to work out whether you have that scope to produce the root base which is deep enough to sustain the thing when the winds blow. And goodness, there were enough Victorian hymns written about, will your anchor hold, and what happens when the storms of life come. And I love every single one of them because I'm morbid that way. But make it a part of your prayer life in this coming week, because week is a useful period of time before I get to hector you again, to look into that paragraph and see what scope it has, and add to that filter the words of St. Paul about the significance of the words you're able to come up with in your own private prayer life, and comfort yourself if you have doubts about your abilities to speak aloud what you experience in your soul, and know that it's accepted you will never be able to do that.